Hello friend, and welcome to Science for Sleep. Tonight, we are beginning with something most people have seen hundreds of times and almost never really questioned. Moss. It appears quietly on tree bark, along damp stones, across old logs, beside streams, on shaded soil, and sometimes even along the edges of roofs and walkways. It is so familiar that it often fades into the background. People notice it the way they notice a patch of green or a cool corner of the forest. They register it, but rarely stop and ask what it actually is. And yet moss is one of those small natural things that becomes much more interesting the moment you begin asking simple questions. What is moss really? Is it just another plant? Or is it something older and stranger than that? Does it have roots the way grass or flowers do? Is it related to fungi? Does it feed on the tree it grows on? Why does it seem to appear in places that feel quiet, shaded, and still? Why does it often make a stone, a stump, or a stretch of forest floor feel softer, older, and calmer? That is part of what makes moss such a beautiful subject to begin with. It hides its complexity extremely well. At first glance, it can look like nothing more than a soft green covering, a kind of living carpet spread over bark or rock. But the closer you look, the more it starts to feel like a world of its own. A patch of moss is not just color, it is structure, it is moisture, it is persistence. It is one of the quietest forms of life many people encounter, and also one of the oldest in spirit. Most people do not grow up learning much about moss. They learn trees, they learn flowers, they learn grass, maybe ferns, maybe mushrooms. Moss often sits somewhere off to the side, familiar but undefined. And because of that, people tend to place it in the wrong category. Some assume moss is a kind of fungus because it grows in damp places and spreads across surfaces. Others assume it must be harmful if it appears on a tree, as though it is feeding on the bark or slowly taking something from the wood beneath it. Some may not even be sure whether moss is one plant or many, whether it is delicate or tough, whether it is alive in the same way a garden plant is alive, or whether it is more like a slow-growing surface growth that simply appears wherever enough water gathers. These questions are worth asking, because moss has a way of rewarding curiosity. It turns out that moss is a plant, but not the kind of plant most people picture first. It does not live like a flower. It does not rise like a tree. It does not push roots deep into soil and send water upward through a strong internal system, the way many larger plants do. In some ways, moss seems to follow its own quiet rules. It stays low. It stays close. It gathers where moisture lingers. It softens surfaces instead of towering above them. There is also something deeply calming about the presence of moss, and many people feel that before they understand it. Moss rarely appears in harsh, exposed places. It belongs to cool corners, shaded trunks, stream banks, forest floors, stone walls, and places where rain seems to last a little longer. When people picture moss, they often picture silence with it. They picture damp air, filtered light, old woods, and the sense that time is moving more slowly there. Moss can make a place feel ancient without making it feel dead. It can make a place feel wild without making it feel threatening. It softens the world. That may be one reason moss leaves such a strong impression when people really notice it. It looks gentle, but it is not fragile in the simple way people might assume. Some mosses can dry out so thoroughly that they appear lifeless, only to recover again when moisture returns. That alone changes the way the subject feels. The soft green layer on a rock is not merely decoration. It is a form of life built for patience, built for waiting, built for returning. And perhaps even more surprisingly, moss is connected to a very old story on Earth. When we look at moss, we are not just looking at something small and green. We are looking at a form of plant life tied to the early history of life on land. Moss carries a kind of biological memory of a much older Earth, one in which small, simple plants were part of the long process that helped turn bare ground into living landscapes. That does not mean the moss outside on a tree trunk is primitive in a careless or dismissive sense. It simply means it belongs to an ancient and enduring way of being alive. Moss did not need to become a tree to survive. It did not need to produce flowers or fruit to matter. It found another path, a quieter one, a lower one, a path shaped by moisture, surface, shade, and time. And that brings us back to one of the most common questions people have when they first begin to think about moss more seriously. Does it hurt what it grows on? If moss covers the side of a tree, or spreads across bark, or wraps itself around roots, is it taking something from that surface? Is it acting like a parasite? Is the tree being slowly damaged beneath that soft green layer? The answer, in most cases, is no. Moss usually does not harm the tree or surface it grows on. It uses that surface as a place to live, not as a body to feed from. That single fact changes the emotional tone of moss quite a lot. It is not usually a thief. It is not quietly draining life from the wood beneath it. It is simply there because the conditions suit it. Shade, moisture, stillness, texture, time. So the next time you see moss on a trunk, a stone, or a fallen log, it may help to pause for a moment and let the questions return. What exactly am I looking at here? Why is it growing in this place and not another? How does it live without looking anything like the plants I know best? Why does it make the world look softer? Why does it make old things look even older? And how can something so small, so quiet, and so often ignored carry such a long and remarkable story within it? There are some parts of the natural world that seem to lower the volume of a place without making any sound at all. Moss is one of them. Even before a person knows what moss is or how it lives, or how old its lineage may be, it often creates a certain feeling. A stone covered in moss looks quieter than bare stone. A fallen log softened by moss seems gentler than the same log left rough and dry. A forest floor touched by moss can feel less exposed, less sharp, and somehow more settled, as though the landscape has been given a softer voice. Part of that feeling begins with texture. Moss does not usually present itself as something rigid or aggressive. It does not have thorns. It does not flash bright petals. It does not rise high into the air and demand attention. Instead, it spreads low and close, forming cushions, mats, and soft coverings that seem to rest upon the surfaces beneath them. Even when seen from a distance, moss often appears velvety. Up close, it can look like tiny green fibers, miniature stems, or dense little tufts that seem almost too delicate to belong outdoors. that softness matters. Human beings tend to respond strongly to surfaces that look gentle, padded, or touchable, even when they are only being seen and not touched at all. Color also plays a powerful role. Moss usually lives in shades of green that feel cool, deep, and restful. Green is one of the most common colors in the living world, but moss often shows a quieter version of it. Not the loud brightness of a tropical leaf, and not the sharp freshness of cut grass in direct sun, but a steadier green, a shaded green, a green touched by moisture, bark, rain, and filtered light. It is a color that blends rather than competes. It tends to soften the places where it appears, making rocks seem older, roots seem calmer, and tree trunks seem more alive in a quiet way. Moss also appears in environments that people already associate with peace. It gathers where water lingers, where sunlight is softened, where air feels cooler, and where the ground holds onto its dampness a little longer. A person is more likely to notice moss in a quiet forest than in a loud, open field. More likely to see it near a stream than beside a dry roadside. More likely to find it on shaded bark, old stones, and fallen wood than on surfaces that are hot, bright, and exposed. This means moss becomes linked, again and again, with the kinds of places that encourage stillness. Over time, that association grows stronger. Moss does not only look calm on its own, it carries the feeling of all the calm places where people tend to find it. There is also something about moss that suggests time without urgency. Many natural things attract attention by showing speed, movement, or sudden change. Flowers bloom, leaves fall, storms arrive, animals dart, climb, or fly. Moss does none of this in a dramatic way. It seems to arrive slowly. It seems to remain. It spreads with such patience that a person can easily imagine it as part of the place itself, rather than a visitor to it. Because of that, moss often makes a landscape feel old in a comforting sense. Not ruined, not abandoned, but settled, as though the place has had enough time to become fully itself. That feeling deepens when moss covers surfaces people already associate with age. A mossy stone wall feels older than the same wall without it. A root wrapped in moss feels more connected to the forest around it. A stump covered in green seems less like a cut remnant, and more like something gently reabsorbed into the life of the woods. Moss blurs the edge between object and environment. It helps bark, stone, and wood seem less separate from the living world around them. This blending effect may be one reason moss feels so soothing. It reduces visual harshness. It softens boundaries. It makes things appear more at rest. Its smallness matters too. Moss invites close looking. A tall tree can inspire awe, but moss often inspires quiet attention. It asks a person to lean in rather than look up. When viewed closely, a patch of moss can resemble a miniature forest, a tiny landscape of green stems and clustered forms. That scale creates intimacy. It gives the impression that an entire world exists below the level where most people usually focus their attention. And hidden worlds often feel calming when they are discovered gently. They make ordinary places feel richer without making them feel overwhelming. Perhaps that is why moss so often becomes part of peaceful gardens, bonsai displays, woodland imagery, and scenes meant to evoke stillness. It offers more than beauty. It offers atmosphere. It suggests cool air, moist earth, filtered light, and time moving quietly across a surface. It can make even a small patch of ground feel like part of a deeper, older landscape. And once that feeling is in place, another question naturally begins to rise beneath it. What kind of plant creates this effect so effortlessly? What is moss actually, if it can soften a place so completely just by being there? Once people begin paying closer attention to moss, one of the first surprises is that it does not fit neatly into the mental picture many people have of a plant. When most people think of plant life, they picture roots pushing into soil, stems lifting upward, leaves reaching for light, and perhaps flowers or seeds appearing at certain times of year. Moss belongs to the plant world, but it does not follow that familiar pattern in the same way. It feels quieter, lower, and somehow older in its design. Moss is a plant, but it is part of a much simpler group of land plants known as non-vascular plants. That phrase may sound technical at first, but the idea behind it is fairly gentle. Larger plants, including trees, grasses, and flowering plants, have an internal transport system that helps move water and nutrients through their bodies. This system allows them to grow taller, support more complex structures, and survive at a greater distance from constant surface moisture. Moss does not have that same kind of internal plumbing. It lives without it, and that fact helps explain nearly everything about the way moss looks and behaves. Because moss lacks that transport system, it usually stays small. It does not rise into tall stems or build trunks the way trees do. It does not send water from deep underground up into branches and leaves. Instead, it remains close to the surfaces where moisture is already available. That is one reason moss often spreads in low cushions, mats, or clusters rather than reaching upward in a dramatic way. Its body is built for nearness. Nearness to bark, soil, rock, rain, and damp air. Another important surprise is that moss does not have true roots in the same sense that many larger plants do. It has tiny thread-like structures called rhizoids that help it attach to a surface. But these are mainly for anchoring rather than for drawing large amounts of water up from deep below. Moss takes in much of what it needs across its outer surfaces. In a sense, it lives more directly in contact with the world around it than many plants do. Water on the bark matters. Water in the air matters. Moisture on stone, wood, or soil matters. Moss does not separate itself much from its surroundings. It stays in close conversation with them. This is part of why moss can grow in places that seem unusual if a person is thinking only in terms of ordinary garden plants. It can appear on tree bark, old logs, stones, roofs, and forest floors. Not because those places are rich in deep soil, but because they offer surfaces and conditions that suit moss's way of living. A damp rock beside a stream may be a perfectly good home for moss. So may a shaded section of bark that stays cool and moist after rain. Moss is less concerned with digging down than with settling in. Its structure reflects this lifestyle. Mosses usually have very small leaf-like parts arranged around delicate stems, but these are not leaves and stems in exactly the same way they are in larger, more familiar plants. Moss occupies its own category of form. Seen from far away, a patch may look smooth and simple, but up close it can seem surprisingly intricate, as though an entire tiny landscape is standing upright in green. different kinds of moss grow in different patterns. Some form dense cushions, some spread outward like a carpet. Some rise in little tufts. The word moss sounds singular, but it contains a quiet diversity. This may help explain why people sometimes confuse moss with other things. Because it grows in damp places and spreads across surfaces, some assume it must be related to fungi. But moss is not a fungus. Fungi do not make food from sunlight the way plants do. Moss does. It belongs to the green living world of photosynthesis, drawing energy from light even while it lives in shadowed places. Its softness and dampness can make it seem almost halfway between plant and surface covering. But it is fully alive in its own botanical way. And because it is so often seen on trees, people also sometimes assume moss is feeding on the tree or harming it. But moss is usually not taking nourishment from the wood beneath it. It is simply using that surface as a place to grow. The tree gives moss a home, not a body to drain. This difference matters because it reminds us that not every living thing found on another surface is an enemy of that surface. Sometimes it is simply a neighbor. What begins to emerge from all of this is a picture of moss as a plant that lives by staying close, staying small, and staying connected to moisture. It does not dominate a landscape through height or color. It works quietly at the edges of stone, bark, and soil. It belongs to the plant kingdom, but it reveals that plant life does not need to become large or obvious to be successful. There is something almost elegant in that. Moss shows that life can remain low to the ground, simple in structure, and modest in appearance, while still spreading across forests, rocks, wetlands, and old wood all over the world. Its design may be ancient, but it is not accidental. It is the design of a plant that found its own way to endure. When people picture ancient life on Earth, they often imagine enormous reptiles, giant ferns, strange sea creatures, or forests unlike anything seen today. But long before many of the familiar plant forms of the modern world came to dominate the land, the surface of Earth was being changed by much smaller and quieter forms of life. The story of moss reaches back toward that older chapter, to a time when living things were still finding ways to leave the water behind and exist on land. For a very long time, life was largely a story of oceans, shorelines, and water-bound environments. Land existed, of course, but much of it would have looked bare compared with the green world people know now. There were no lawns, no forests of flowering trees, no fields of grass waving in the wind. The movement of life onto land happened gradually, over immense stretches of time, and the earliest land plants were very different from the familiar plants most people see today. Moss belongs to a branch of plant life that reflects something of that early world. It is not that modern moss is a frozen leftover from the distant past, unchanged in every detail, but it does belong to an old and simple style of plant life, one that helps people imagine how modest the first green steps onto land may have been. Before tall trunks and deep roots, before flowers and fruits, there were smaller plants living in close contact with moisture, spreading over surfaces, staying low, and making land a little more alive than it had been before. That is part of what makes moss feel so quietly profound. A patch of moss on a rock may look small and ordinary, but it belongs to a very long story. It hints at a world in which greening the land did not begin with towering forests. It began with life that could survive close to damp surfaces, take in light, and gradually establish a presence where there had once been mostly bare ground and stone. In that sense, moss carries an old pattern of living. It stays close to the surface. It depends heavily on moisture. It does not build woody trunks or send roots deep into the earth. It works with direct contact, with short distances, with patience. These are qualities that make sense in a very early land world, where drying out would have been a constant threat, and where life on land had not yet evolved the full range of structures seen in later plants. Over time, of course, plant life diversified. Larger vascular plants emerged, able to move water internally and rise higher into the air. Roots became more elaborate. Stems strengthened. Leaves grew larger and more complex. Forests eventually transformed the face of continents. But moss and its relatives did not disappear when these newer plant strategies appeared. They remained. They kept their quieter way of living and continued to thrive in the kinds of environments that suited them best. There is something beautiful about that continuity. Moss does not feel ancient because it is large or dramatic. It feels ancient because its whole design suggests an older conversation between life and land. It is a reminder that success in nature does not always mean becoming bigger, louder, or more dominant. Sometimes it means finding a small, stable way to exist and holding on to it across astonishing lengths of time. That may also be why moss feels so timeless in the modern world. When people see it wrapping around roots, softening stones, or covering old bark, it can seem almost outside of ordinary pace. Moss does not look hurried. It does not look temporary. It looks as though it belongs to deep time, even when it is growing only a few steps away from a sidewalk or garden path. And in a way, it does. Moss carries forward one of the older forms of plant life still living on land today. It connects cool forests and damp stones to a much earlier earth, one in which the green world was only beginning to take shape. That alone makes moss far more than a background detail. It is part of a lineage that helped make land feel living. The more a person sits with that thought, the more remarkable moss begins to seem. What looks like a simple green layer on bark is tied to the ancient expansion of life onto continents. What appears soft and small is connected to one of the great transformations in Earth's history. Moss may not announce that story loudly, but it carries it quietly all the same. And once that age settles into view, another question begins to feel even more interesting. If moss belongs to such an old and enduring way of life, why did it remain so small? Why did it stay close to the ground while other plants rose into trees, forests, and towering canopies? It is natural to look at moss and wonder whether it represents an early step towards something larger, as though it began as a simple green plant and never quite made it to the next stage. But that way of thinking can be misleading. Moss is not an unfinished tree. It is not a failed flower or a primitive version of a taller plant waiting to be improved. Moss followed a different path from the beginning, and that path shaped the way it still lives today. The main reason moss never became tree-like has to do with the way water moves through a plant body. Trees, grasses, shrubs, and flowering plants belong to groups that developed vascular tissue, an internal transport system that carries water and dissolved nutrients from one part of the plant to another. This system makes great height possible. A tree can draw water up from the ground, move it through roots and trunk, and deliver it to leaves held far above the soil. Without that hidden internal movement, tall growth becomes extremely difficult. Moss does not have that kind of transport system. It belongs to an older and simpler style of plant life, one that remains closely tied to surface moisture. Instead of pulling water up through deep roots and tall stems, moss absorbs much of its water directly through its outer tissues. This means distance becomes a problem very quickly. The farther a plant tries to rise from the damp surface that supports it, the harder it becomes to keep all of its parts supplied with enough water. Staying small is not a weakness for moss. It is part of the logic of its entire way of life. This helps explain why moss so often appears as a low layer over bark, soil, stone, or wood. It spreads outward more easily than upward. It forms cushions, carpets, and little clusters, because those shapes keep the plant close to moisture and close to the surfaces where water tends to linger after rain or in shade. Moss is built for nearness, not height. It lives well by remaining in direct contact with the microworld around it. A tall plant also needs support. A tree trunk is not just a pipe for water. It is a structure strong enough to hold weight, resist bending, and keep branches lifted into open air. Moss does not build wood. It does not harden into trunks or thick stems. Its tissues remain soft, flexible, and light. That softness is part of what makes moss feel so calming to look at. But it also means moss is not trying to solve the same structural problems a tree must solve. It does not need to hold up a crown of leaves. It does not need to compete for the highest layer of sunlight in a crowded forest. It survives in quieter spaces. In fact, becoming taller would not necessarily have helped moss. Many mosses thrive in shaded, damp conditions where moisture matters more than direct access to the strongest sunlight. Rising higher into the air could expose them to more drying wind and sun, which would work against their way of living. Their small size allows them to stay tucked into the cool edges of the world, where bark stays damp, where stones sweat moisture after rain, and where the forest floor holds onto humidity. What makes moss seem humble is also what makes it well suited to those places. There is something important in that. Nature does not move in a straight line toward one final ideal form. Taller is not always better. Bigger is not always more advanced in any useful sense. Moss did not miss its chance to become a tree. It remained moss because moss works. It found a stable strategy early on and kept refining that strategy over immense spans of time. Staying low, spreading gently, absorbing water directly, and living in close contact with surfaces turned out to be a successful way to exist. That may be one reason moss still feels so distinct from the rest of the plant world. It reminds people that life can solve the problem of being alive in many different ways. One solution is to rise, harden, branch, and tower. Another is to soften, cling, spread, and remain close to moisture. Both can endure. Both can shape a landscape, but they create very different kinds of presence. Moss belongs to the quieter kind. It does not cast a giant shadow. It does not dominate a horizon. It changes the world at a smaller scale, drawing the eye downward instead of upward. It is one of the clearest examples in nature of how a living thing can remain simple in form while being deeply successful in its own environment. And once that becomes clear, another part of moss starts to seem even more remarkable. If it lives without the deep roots people usually associate with plants, How does it stay in place at all? And how does it take in the water it depends on so completely? One of the most surprising things about moss is that it can look so settled, so securely placed, and yet live without the kind of roots people usually associate with plants. When most people imagine a plant holding itself in place, they picture roots reaching down into soil, branching outward, drawing in water and minerals from below. That image is so familiar that it almost feels like a rule. Plants have roots. Roots go into the ground. That is simply what plants do. Moss gently breaks that expectation. Moss does have tiny thread-like structures called rhizoids, and these help it stay attached to the surface where it grows. But rhizoids are not true roots in the same sense that the roots of a tree, grass, or flower are true roots. They do not function as deep underground systems built to pull large amounts of water upward through the plant. Instead, their role is much simpler. They help anchor moss in place. They help it cling to bark, stone, soil, old wood, or other surfaces where it has found suitable conditions. In a way, rhizoids help moss stay close to its chosen surface rather than reach down into some hidden supply far below. That distinction tells us a great deal about how moss lives. Moss does not depend on deep extraction. It depends on closeness. It lives in intimate contact with the surface world around it. Rainfall matters, mist matters, humid air matters. Water that settles briefly on bark or stone matters. Moss takes in much of what it needs across its outer surfaces, absorbing moisture directly rather than relying on a buried root network to deliver it from below. This makes moss feel less like a plant that mines the earth and more like one that drinks from the skin of the world. That way of living explains why moss can grow in places that seem strange if a person is thinking in terms of ordinary rooted plants. A tree trunk does not look like the kind of place where a plant should make a home. Neither does a stone wall, a fallen log, or the surface of a shaded rock. And yet moss can live on all of these. It does not need a deep pocket of soil to begin. What it needs is a surface that can hold some moisture, a place where it can remain attached, and conditions that do not dry it too quickly. Give moss shade, dampness, and time, and it can settle into places that larger plants would find impossible. This also means moss is unusually sensitive to its immediate surroundings. Because it absorbs water and nutrients across its body, it is constantly responding to what is happening right where it lives. The texture of a rock matters. The roughness of bark matters. The amount of filtered light matters. The moisture in the air matters. Even small differences in shade or exposure can shape whether moss thrives, pauses, or disappears. Moss does not separate itself much from its environment. It remains deeply exposed to it, deeply dependent on it, and deeply formed by it. There is something almost elegant in that kind of life. Moss does not build a large internal distance between itself and the world. A tree stands partly apart from its surroundings. It reaches high into the air while drawing deeply from below. Moss stays much closer to the surface of experience. It receives water where it lands. It lives where moisture lingers. It anchors lightly, absorbs directly, and remains physically near the little textures and wetnesses that sustain it. This may be one reason moss often feels so intimate when viewed closely. It seems woven into the place where it lives rather than imposed upon it. Its way of feeding and drinking is also part of what makes moss seem so different from more familiar plants. Many plants give the impression of strong separation. Their roots are hidden, their stems are upright, and their leaves rise into open space. Moss feels less divided. It spreads across surfaces in a way that makes it seem almost continuous with bark, wood, or stone. The boundary between the plant and its setting feels softer. Moss does not simply occupy a place. It seems to belong to it. And because it lives this way, moss ends up favoring a particular kind of world. It works best where moisture is dependable, where sunlight is softened, and where surfaces remain cool enough for water to linger. Its body is built for those conditions. Its entire design points toward them. Once that becomes clear, the places where moss appears begin to make much more sense. The shaded side of a tree, the edge of a stream, the damp skin of a stone, the quiet floor of the forest. These are not random backdrops for moss. They are the kinds of places its way of life was made for. Once it becomes clear how moss lives, the places where it appears begin to feel much less mysterious. Moss is not scattered randomly across the world. It gathers where its needs are quietly being met. It prefers places that hold onto moisture, soften sunlight, and stay a little cooler than the more exposed parts of the landscape. In other words, moss tends to live where the world feels gentler. Shade is one of the most important parts of that picture. Because moss absorbs water across much of its surface, it is far more vulnerable to drying out than many larger plants that can rely on deep roots or internal transport systems. Direct sun can quickly pull moisture away from a moss patch, especially when the air is warm or moving. Shade slows that process down. It protects the thin, exposed body of moss from losing water too quickly, and it helps create the kind of stable conditions moss depends on. A shaded stone can remain damp long after an open one has dried. A cool tree trunk can hold a trace of moisture after rain. A patch of forest floor beneath branches can stay humid and protected, even while brighter places nearby become dry. Rain matters for obvious reasons, but it is not only heavy rain that supports moss. Mist, dew, humidity, and lingering dampness all matter too. Moss is well suited to places where water arrives gently and often, or where moisture remains in the air and on surfaces for long enough to be useful. This is why moss so often appears near streams, along the edges of creeks, on rotting logs, in shaded gardens, on north-facing bark, and in old forests where the air can feel thick with coolness. It does not need dramatic weather. It needs consistency. It needs the kind of environment where wetness is not rare. There is also a strong connection between moss and surfaces that can hold or shelter moisture. Bark, soil, stone, and decaying wood all offer slightly different versions of the world moss prefers. Bark can provide texture, shade, and a place for water to linger in tiny grooves. Stones can remain cool and damp, especially in shaded places near moving water. Soil on the forest floor can stay soft and humid beneath leaves and branches. Fallen logs, especially as they age and begin to break down, can hold both moisture and organic material in ways that make them especially welcoming. Moss often seems to choose these places because, in a sense, they are already halfway prepared for it. That is one reason moss is so strongly associated with quiet natural settings. It often appears in places where movement is slower and conditions are steadier. A rushing road shoulder, a hot dry field, or a fully exposed rooftop does not usually offer the same kind of stable moisture that moss prefers. But a forest floor, a creek bank, a shaded stone wall, or the lower side of a tree trunk can. Moss follows moisture, and moisture so often belongs to the calmer parts of a landscape. Over time, this gives moss a strong emotional association with stillness. People see it where the air is cooler, the sounds are softer, and the pace of change feels lower. Even the look of moss reflects this environment. It rarely appears harsh or tense. It seems to settle into the places where it grows, shaping itself to the bark, wrapping gently over roots, softening stones, or spreading over old wood like a living blanket. It does not arrive with the drama of a flower blooming or the sudden force of a vine climbing. It arrives quietly, often so gradually that a person may feel it has always been there. Its favorite environments encourage that impression. Shade and moisture create the conditions for a slower visual story, one in which growth feels more like deepening than appearing. This also helps explain why moss can make a place feel older. Places that remain moist, shaded, and undisturbed long enough for moss to thrive often already carry a sense of age. The presence of moss reinforces that feeling. It suggests time has passed without interruption. It suggests a kind of patience in the landscape. A stone covered with moss does not merely look green. It looks as though it has been allowed to remain where it is, long enough for softness to gather upon it. Of course, not every kind of moss grows in exactly the same conditions, and moss can appear in a wider range of environments than people sometimes expect. But the general pattern remains remarkably consistent. Moss does best where water stays close, where sunlight is filtered, and where surfaces remain cool enough to support that intimate style of life. It belongs to edges, understories, damp corners, and quiet ground. What first looked like one kind of green covering begins to separate into many forms. Some patches are thick and cushiony. Some are flat and spreading. Some rise in tiny little stems like a miniature forest. The more closely one looks, the more varied moss begins to seem. At a distance, moss can seem almost simple. It appears as a soft green layer spread over bark, wood, stone, or soil, and the eye can easily read it as one thing. But that first impression begins to change the moment a person looks more closely. Moss is not one uniform surface. It is not one shape repeated across the world. What people casually call moss includes a surprising variety of forms, textures, and growth patterns, each one reflecting a different way of living close to moisture and light. Some mosses grow in dense rounded cushions, almost like little green pillows pressed against rock or soil. These cushion-forming mosses can make the ground look tufted and plush, as though the landscape has been padded in small domes. Others spread more thinly and broadly, creating carpets that hug the surface beneath them. These carpet-like mosses can soften a fallen log, cover the base of a tree, or stretch across damp ground in a way that makes the earth itself seem greener and gentler. Still others rise in tiny upright clusters, with delicate stems standing close together, so that a patch of moss begins to resemble a miniature grove or a tiny field of green threads. That is one of the most enchanting things about moss. It often rewards attention by becoming more complex the closer it is viewed. What first looked like a flat layer can reveal itself as countless tiny structures standing, bending, clustering, or overlapping. A single patch may contain little peaks, tiny fronds, star-like tops, or densely packed stems that seem almost architectural when seen at the right scale. Moss shrinks the distance between plant life and landscape. Instead of being a large organism in a large scene, it can feel like a tiny landscape in itself. Different forms of moss often suit different surfaces and conditions. A damp forest floor may invite one kind of growth pattern, while a rock beside a stream may support another. Bark, soil, decaying wood, and stone each hold water differently, warm and cool at different rates, and offer different textures for moss to settle into. Some mosses seem better adapted to spreading into broad mats where moisture stays relatively even. Others seem built for little mounds or clusters where surface shape and drainage create more variation. Even slight differences in shade, air movement, and humidity can influence which mosses thrive and how they appear. This variety is part of why moss can make a place feel visually rich without becoming loud. It adds detail at a smaller scale than most people usually notice. A hillside may look simply green from afar, but down at the level of bark and stone, moss can be doing many different things at once. One patch may be smooth and velvety. Another may be wiry and upright. Another may look almost feathery, while another appears dense and sponge-like. These differences are easy to overlook when moving quickly through a space, but once noticed, they can completely change the way a woodland floor or old wall is seen. There is also a quiet emotional effect that comes from this miniature diversity. Because moss grows so small, its different forms often feel like a hidden world, tucked beneath ordinary attention. Looking closely at moss can create the strange impression of discovering a forest within the forest, a landscape within the landscape. Tiny stems become like trees. Rounded cushions become little hills. Moist hollows between patches become valleys of shade. It is one of the few common forms of plant life that can make a person feel both large and gently invited to look smaller. That invitation matters. Moss does not impress through size. It impresses through detail, patience, and variation. A field of flowers may announce its beauty immediately. Moss often waits. It asks for a slower gaze. But when that gaze arrives, it offers a richness that can feel almost disproportionate to its scale. What seemed modest becomes intricate. What seemed repetitive becomes full of character. This may also help explain why moss has inspired so much affection in gardens, terrariums, bonsai displays, and woodland imagery. It carries variety without clutter. It can make a space feel lush, ancient, and alive while remaining visually quiet. Its many forms help create that feeling. Moss is not one note of green. It is a whole soft range of shapes and textures. And once that variety begins to come into view, another part of moss becomes easier to appreciate as well. All of those little cushions, carpets, and clusters are not only beautiful on their own. Together, they begin to change the places where they grow, especially along the ground, where moss becomes part of the living surface of the forest itself. By the time a person begins noticing the many forms of moss, it becomes easier to see that moss is doing more than decorating the places where it grows. It is not just resting on the forest floor, like a soft green layer placed there for appearance. In many environments, moss becomes part of the living surface itself. It changes how the ground feels, how moisture lingers, and how small forms of life experience the space close to the earth. One of the simplest ways moss changes the forest floor is by covering it. Bare soil, exposed roots, fallen wood, and stone can all feel sharper, drier, and more separate without it. Moss softens those surfaces. It fills gaps, spreads over edges, and creates a living skin across places that might otherwise seem rough or unfinished. A mossy patch of ground often looks more settled than a bare one, as though the forest has had time to lay down another layer of quiet life over everything beneath it. That covering also affects moisture. Moss is very good at holding water near the surface, which means it can slow the quick loss of dampness after rain, mist, or dew. Instead of water disappearing immediately from the uppermost layer of the forest floor, moss helps keep some of that moisture close. This does not mean moss turns the ground into a soaked sponge everywhere it grows, but it does mean that the tiny world at the surface can remain cooler and wetter for longer than it otherwise might. In a forest, that matters. So much of life happens in that small zone between air and earth, where the condition of the surface shapes everything above and below it. Because moss holds moisture and reduces exposure, it can also buffer small temperature swings. A surface covered with moss may not heat as quickly in sunlight, or dry as abruptly when conditions shift. The effect is subtle, but forests are built from subtle effects. Tiny differences in wetness, warmth, shade, and surface softness can influence where other small plants begin, where tiny organisms gather, and how long delicate conditions last after weather changes. Moss helps create a quieter, steadier kind of ground. This is especially noticeable on decaying wood and old logs. A fallen trunk without moss can look dry, open, and in some places almost stripped back to its structure. But once moss spreads across it, that same log begins to feel more fully absorbed into the life of the forest. The moss helps hold moisture against the wood, softens its shape, and visually draws it back into the surrounding landscape. The log no longer looks like a dead object lying apart from the forest. It becomes part of the forest floor's ongoing living texture. Moss has a similar effect on stones and exposed roots. A rock covered in moss does not seem as hard or separate as bare stone. A root wrapped in green appears less harsh and more continuous with the ground around it. Moss reduces visual severity. It blurs the transition between one surface and another. In doing so, it gives the forest floor a more connected appearance, as though bark, wood, soil, and stone are being gently tied together by living softness. There is also an emotional side to this transformation. Forests often feel calming, not only because of trees overhead, but because of what is happening below. The ground in a healthy, moss-rich place can appear cushioned, cool, and undisturbed. It looks like a surface that receives falling leaves, rain, and time without becoming harsh. Moss contributes to that feeling more than people may realize. It helps create the sense that the forest floor is not merely ground to walk on, but a layered living surface where moisture, decay, renewal, and shelter all meet quietly. Of course, moss is only one part of that larger story. Leaves, fungi, soil organisms, roots, and fallen branches all shape the floor of a forest as well. But moss occupies a special role because it is so often the visible softening layer. It is what people notice first when the ground seems especially hushed or velvety. It makes the forest feel less exposed and more gathered into itself. And that brings up one of the most common questions people have when they see moss spread over trunks, roots, and branches as well as the ground. If moss is changing these surfaces so noticeably, is it helping them, merely resting on them, or actually causing harm? That question is especially common when moss appears on trees, where its presence can easily be misunderstood. When people see moss climbing a trunk or spreading across an old branch, it is very common for a certain suspicion to arise. The moss looks attached. It looks settled. Sometimes it appears thick enough to seem as though it must be taking something from the tree beneath it. And because people are used to hearing about harmful growths on plants, it is easy to assume moss belongs in the same category. But in most cases, moss is not hurting the tree at all. The key thing to understand is that moss is usually using the tree as a surface, not as a food source. It is growing on the bark, not feeding from the tree's internal tissues. It does not sink roots into the trunk and begin drawing out the tree's nutrients in the way a true parasite would. Moss simply takes advantage of a place that offers the conditions it likes. If a trunk is shaded, textured, and able to hold a little moisture, that bark may become a very suitable home for moss. The tree provides a location, not a meal. This is an important distinction because appearance can be misleading. When something green spreads across another living thing, people often assume there must be a direct struggle involved. But in the case of moss, what is usually happening is much quieter than that. The moss is occupying the outer surface of the bark while living according to its own needs, drawing moisture from rain, mist, and humid air, rather than extracting resources from deep inside the tree. It is more like a tenant of the bark's surface than an attacker of the tree itself. In fact, the presence of moss often tells a person more about the environment than about the health of the tree. Moss tends to appear where shade lingers, where humidity stays relatively high, and where bark remains cool enough for moisture to hang on after rain. An older tree in a damp, calm, partially shaded place may simply offer exactly the kind of conditions moss prefers. In that sense, moss can be a sign of the setting rather than a sign of damage. It reflects where the tree is living, not necessarily what is going wrong with it. That said, people sometimes notice moss on aging trees, declining branches, or orchards where a tree already appears weak, and this can make moss look guilty by association. But in many of those cases, the moss did not create the weakness. It arrived because the conditions had become favorable. A slower growing branch, a roughening bark surface, a more open canopy that changed moisture patterns, or simply long-term shade, may all make it easier for moss to settle. The tree's condition and the moss's presence can occur together without one being the direct cause of the other. There is also a visual reason why moss gets blamed so easily. Moss makes surfaces look older. It softens bark, fills cracks, wraps around roots, and gives trunks a feeling of age and stillness. When people see a tree covered in moss, they may instinctively connect that aged appearance with decline. But age and decline are not the same thing. And moss is especially good at creating an old, weathered, forested look, even on trees that are simply growing in the right environment for it. In most natural settings, then, moss is best understood as a harmless companion of bark rather than a threat to it. It uses the tree's outer surface as a place to anchor and grow, but it is not generally parasitic. It belongs to the shaded, moisture-loving life of the forest, and trees are simply one of the many surfaces that can become part of that quiet world. There are, of course, situations where very heavy surface growth on a plant may be discussed in practical gardening or orchard care, especially if people are concerned about airflow, light, or the difficulty of seeing the bark beneath. But that is different from saying moss itself is feeding on the tree. The main idea remains the same. Moss is usually present because the conditions allow it, not because it has overpowered the tree. And once that fear is set aside, moss becomes easier to appreciate for what it really is. Instead of something sinister clinging to bark, it becomes part of the soft outer life of the forest. It becomes a green resting layer on trunks, roots, logs, and stones. It becomes another way the landscape gathers moisture and time onto its surfaces. Seen that way, a moss-covered trunk is not a scene of quiet damage. It is a meeting place between two different forms of life, one tall and woody, the other low and soft, sharing the same damp, shaded world. And in that shared world, the moss is not alone. Its little cushions and mats often create room for many other forms of life as well, especially at a scale so small that most people pass by without ever noticing it. Once moss is no longer seen as a simple green coating, it becomes easier to notice that it is also a place. Not just a plant, but a setting. A patch of moss may look small to a human eye, but at the scale of tiny life, it can function almost like a miniature landscape, full of shelter, moisture, surfaces, shadows, and protected spaces. What appears soft and quiet from above can be surprisingly busy when imagined from within. One reason moss becomes such a good home for small forms of life is that it holds moisture so well. Many tiny organisms depend on dampness, or at least benefit from places where the air remains less dry and the surface stays cooler. Moss helps create exactly that kind of environment. Between its tiny stems and leaf-like structures, water can linger. Humidity can remain higher. Light can be softened. For creatures too small to cross great distances easily, those tiny differences matter. A moss patch may offer the kind of stable micro-world that bare bark or dry stone cannot. Small invertebrates are among the lives most often associated with moss. Tiny creatures can move through it, hide beneath it, and shelter within it. For them, moss is not flat. It is structured. It has little openings, raised stems, shaded pockets, and damp passages. A patch of moss can provide cover from direct sun, protection from sudden drying, and a surface rich in microscopic material to explore. To a tiny animal, moss may feel less like a surface and more like terrain. Microbes and microscopic life also find opportunity there. Moss-rich places can support communities too small to be seen without magnification, yet important all the same. Moisture, organic particles, filtered light, and stable surfaces all help create conditions where very small living things can persist. The human eye may see only one green layer, but that layer may be participating in a whole web of life, far below ordinary notice. Even larger animals sometimes interact with moss in simple but meaningful ways. Birds may gather moss as nesting material, using its softness and springiness to line or cushion a nest. Small mammals may take advantage of moss-covered surfaces as sheltered or camouflaged parts of their environment. Moss can also become part of the places where eggs are laid, insects rest, or hidden life passes unnoticed through the understory. It does not need to be dramatic to be useful. Its value lies in offering texture, softness, moisture, and concealment. There is something especially beautiful about this when imagined closely. To a human being, moss often seems delicate and low. But to something tiny, a moss cushion may resemble a forest of stems. A hollow between two patches may feel like a cool green valley. Moisture clinging to the surfaces may create an entire weather system at that miniature scale. In this way, moss reminds us that size changes everything. What looks simple from above becomes richly complex when the frame of reference shifts downward. This hidden complexity may be one reason moss feels so alive even when it appears still. It suggests that life does not only happen in large, obvious ways. Not every ecosystem is a sweeping forest canopy or a broad wetland. Some ecosystems are only a few inches across. Some exist in the soft green rise on a log or in the damp coating of an old stone wall. Moss gathers enough water, enough structure, and enough steadiness to let other forms of life settle into its little world. It also helps explain why moss feels so connected to gentleness. A harsh surface rarely offers much shelter. Moss does. It softens bark, wood, and rock, not only for the eye, but in practical ways for the tiny lives that depend on soft transitions, protected gaps, and moisture that lingers. It turns exposed places into quieter ones. It makes a surface more habitable. The more closely one looks, the more moss begins to feel less like a plant sitting alone and more like a host of conditions. It is surface and shelter, moisture and texture, a tiny architecture for overlooked life. That does not mean every patch of moss is crowded with visible movement. Often, its richness is subtle, hidden, and easy to miss. But that hidden richness is part of what makes moss so rewarding to think about. It is a quiet reminder that life often gathers where conditions are gentle enough to hold it. And beneath all of this, one element keeps returning again and again: moisture. The dampness moss holds, softens, and slows is part of what makes all these tiny worlds possible. To understand moss more fully, it helps to stay with that relationship a little longer and look at the deeper role moss plays in the movement and holding of water itself. Again and again, moss leads back to the same quiet element: water. Not rushing water alone, and not only heavy rain, but moisture in all its softer forms. Mist in the air, dampness on bark, water held in soil after a storm, dew gathered on surfaces before sunrise. Moss lives so closely with moisture that it can almost seem less like a plant resting on the landscape and more like part of the landscape's way of handling water itself. One of the simplest ways to understand this is to picture moss as a kind of soft living sponge. That comparison is not perfect, but it comes close to the feeling of what moss does. Moss can take in and hold a surprising amount of water relative to its size. Its tiny structures create countless small spaces where moisture can collect and linger. Instead of water passing quickly over a surface and disappearing, moss helps slow that movement down. It gives moisture somewhere to pause. That pause matters. In the natural world, speed changes everything. Water that races off a surface immediately is different from water that lingers for a while in shade, tucked among tiny green stems. Moss helps create those slower moments. It softens the movement of wetness across bark, stone, soil, and wood, holding some of it close rather than letting all of it vanish at once. Because of that, a mossy patch often remains damp longer than the bare surface beside it. This helps create small, moist environments that support more than the moss alone. A surface covered in moss can stay cooler and less dry, giving tiny organisms, delicate plant beginnings, and other nearby life a more stable place to exist. The difference may seem small from a human point of view, but much of nature depends on small differences. A few more hours of dampness after rain, a little more humidity close to the ground, a shaded patch that does not dry as abruptly in the afternoon. These slight shifts can influence where life gathers and how comfortably it continues. Moss is especially well suited to this role because its entire way of living is tied to capturing, holding, and responding to moisture. Water is not merely something moss consumes and then forgets. Water shapes moss from the outside in. It influences where moss grows, how it spreads, when it appears most alive, and how it interacts with the world around it. Moisture is part of moss's body story, part of its habitat story, and part of its environmental role all at once. That is one reason moss can make a place feel so fresh and cool, even when no visible water is present. A moss-covered log may suggest dampness even on a quiet day. A green patch on a stone can make the stone seem cooler than it would otherwise appear. Moss becomes a visual sign that moisture has been here, that water tends to return here, that this surface belongs to the gentler side of the landscape. In that way, moss helps shape not only physical conditions, but the whole feeling of a place. There is also something beautifully balanced in this relationship. Moss depends on moisture, but it also helps hold moisture in the environment around it. It is supported by wetness, and then in turn helps preserve some of that wetness near the surface. This creates a kind of quiet partnership between plant and place. Moss is not only receiving conditions, it is participating in them. It is helping the surface world remain softer, cooler, and less sudden in the way it dries. This becomes especially meaningful on forest floors, old logs, shaded rocks, and streamside surfaces, where the presence of moss can make the boundary between wet and dry less abrupt. A harsh surface sheds water quickly. Moss eases that process. It cushions it. It turns the moment after rain into something longer and calmer. Water does not simply arrive and leave. For a while, it stays among the tiny structures of moss, changing the feel of the place. And once that relationship between moss and moisture is fully seen, the subject begins to grow larger than bark, stones, and forest floors. In some parts of the world, certain mosses do far more than soften a surface or hold a little extra dampness. Over long periods of time, they help shape entire wet landscapes. They help build bogs, store water across wide areas, and contribute to the slow making of peat itself. What first seemed like a small story of moisture on bark begins opening into a much larger story of moss and land. Up to this point, moss has mostly been a small-scale subject. It has lived on bark, stones, roots, logs, and shaded ground. It has softened surfaces, held moisture close, and created tiny worlds for overlooked life. But in some places, moss steps into a much larger role. It does not simply cover the land, it helps build it. This is especially true in the case of sphagnum moss, often associated with peatlands and bogs. Sphagnum is a kind of moss with remarkable water-holding ability, and over long stretches of time, it can help create entire wet landscapes. In these places, moss is no longer just a green layer resting on the world. It becomes part of the slow architecture of the land itself. One of the most striking things about sphagnum moss is how much water it can hold. It gathers and retains moisture so effectively that landscapes dominated by it tend to stay wet, acidic, and unlike the drier ground people may know more intimately. These are not just soggy places in a simple sense. They are environments shaped by a long partnership between water, slow plant growth, and incomplete decay. That slower decay is one of the keys to the story. In many ordinary environments, dead plant material breaks down relatively fully and returns to the soil. But in boggy, waterlogged places where oxygen is limited and conditions are unusual, decomposition can be slowed. Over time, layers of partly decayed plant matter accumulate. This material is known as peat, and moss, especially sphagnum, often plays a major role in that accumulation. So here, moss is doing something extraordinary. It grows, dies back, partially persists, and helps create the very ground on which future moss and wetland life continue. Layer by layer, over years and then centuries, this process can build thick peat deposits. A listener might begin with the image of a soft green moss patch and end with the realization that such a plant can help shape whole landscapes over immense spans of time. That is a remarkable expansion in scale. Bogs and peatlands are also special because they store water in a lasting way. Their surfaces and underlying layers can act almost like great wet natural reserves, holding moisture across broad areas. The landscape becomes defined by retention, saturation, and slow change. Trees may be sparse in some places. The ground may tremble slightly underfoot. Pools, hummocks, and soft mossy rises may repeat across the surface. Everything about the place can feel patient and suspended, as though the land itself has slowed down. These environments often support unusual ecological conditions as well. The chemistry, wetness, and low oxygen conditions of peatlands can make them very different from nearby forests or meadows. Certain plants thrive there, while others do not. The moss is not just surviving in a wet landscape that already exists. It is helping create the conditions that define that landscape in the first place. There is something almost humbling in that. It is easy to assume that only large plants shape land in important ways. Trees, after all, define forests. Grasses define prairies. Reeds define marsh edges. But here is moss, one of the smallest and quietest plant forms, helping build broad wetland systems through persistence, absorbency, and time. It does not transform land through force. It transforms land by staying, holding water, slowing decay, and repeating that cycle for longer than a human life can easily picture. This larger role also changes the emotional impression of moss. It remains soft, low, and quiet. But it is no longer only delicate. It becomes formative. It becomes a maker of conditions, a slow engineer of wet ground. In a bog, moss is not simply part of the scenery. It is part of the reason the scenery exists in that form at all. And yet, even in these grander landscapes, moss still performs the same basic kind of work it always has. It gathers moisture. It holds it. It alters the surface. It creates a place where different conditions can persist. The scale changes, but the nature of the relationship does not. Moss still lives through nearness to water. It just happens that in some places, that nearness becomes powerful enough to shape an entire world. Seen this way, moss becomes not only a plant, but a kind of quiet indicator. Whether it is softening a tree root, covering a stone wall, or helping form a bog, its presence says something about the place around it. It reveals shade, dampness, coolness, and the slow rhythms of the environment. Moss does not only live in a place, it helps describe that place. By now, moss begins to feel less like a background detail and more like a quiet messenger. It does not speak in words, of course, and it does not announce itself dramatically, but its presence often tells a careful observer something meaningful about the place where it lives. A patch of moss can suggest that moisture lingers there. It can hint that sunlight is filtered rather than harsh. It can imply that the surface stays cool, that the air is humid, or that the environment changes gently enough for soft life to remain in place. In that sense, moss becomes a kind of environmental signal, not a perfect one, and not a universal one in every case, but often a revealing one. When moss appears thickly on bark, wood, or stone, it usually means the conditions have allowed that growth to continue. The place is likely not drying out too quickly. The surface may be rough enough to hold moisture. Shade may be present for much of the day. Air may move less harshly there. The moss reflects those conditions, almost the way a stain reflects the path of water or the shape of light in a room. This is part of what makes moss so satisfying to notice in the wild. It offers clues. A damp log in deep shade may be coated in one kind of moss, while a brighter rock with only brief moisture may support another or none at all. A cool creekside bank, a north-facing tree trunk, an old stone wall, a forest hollow, or a moist garden edge can each tell slightly different stories through the moss growing there. The plant is not only occupying the environment, it is recording in a living way what that environment tends to be like. Different mosses also prefer different conditions, which adds another layer to that story. Some are better suited to persist on soil, others on bark, others on stone, and some thrive in wetter or more acidic places than others. A person who studies moss closely can begin to see distinctions that most people miss entirely. What looks like one general greenness may actually be a set of different responses to texture, moisture, light, and climate. Moss becomes not just a sign of life, but a sign of what kind of life the place can support. Even without knowing species names, people often sense this instinctively. A mossy place feels different from a non-mossy one. It feels quieter, cooler, softer, more settled. The moss is part of the reason, but it is also evidence. It tells the eye that the conditions here are not harsh or fleeting. They are favorable to lingering dampness and slow growth. that can make moss feel almost like a visual shorthand for calm. A surface with moss suggests patience in the landscape, a lack of violence in the recent weather, a little shelter from direct extremes. Moss can also reveal something about age and continuity. A rock or fallen log covered in moss suggests that it has remained in place long enough for softness to gather upon it. The same is often true of old bark, roots, and walls. Moss does not always require great age, but it often benefits from stability. It likes surfaces that are not constantly overturned, scoured, or stripped back. So when moss is present, it may imply not just moisture and shade, but also some degree of quiet persistence. The place has been allowed to be itself for a while. This may be why moss feels so expressive despite being so understated. It can make a forest seem deep. It can make a garden corner seem more protected. It can make stone feel older, bark feel cooler, and land feel more intimate. Moss helps define the character of a place by responding faithfully to its conditions. It is both participant and sign. It grows because the environment permits it, and then, once it is there, it helps the eye understand what kind of environment this is. Seen this way, moss becomes something close to a portrait of place. Not a full portrait, of course, because no single plant can tell the whole story of a landscape. But moss often captures the gentler side of that story. It marks where water stays near, where light softens, where air remains cool enough for moisture to matter, and where surfaces are stable enough for small life to settle in. And once moss begins to feel like that kind of companion to human observation, it becomes easier to imagine how long people must have lived alongside it. Long before moss was studied scientifically, it would have already been present in forests, wetlands, rocky ground, and shaded dwellings, quietly familiar to generations who did not need a formal name for it in order to notice its softness, usefulness, and place in the world around them. Long before moss became something a person might identify in a field guide or study through botany, it would have already been part of ordinary human experience. People living close to forests, wetlands, river edges, rocky ground, and cool shaded places would have seen it constantly. It would have been underfoot, along tree roots, across stones, on fallen logs, around springs, and in the soft, quiet corners of the landscape where moisture stayed close. Moss was not rare, and because it was not rare, it likely became familiar in the deep and practical way that many useful natural materials do. That kind of familiarity matters. Human beings have always lived by noticing the textures and behaviors of the materials around them. Which plants sting, which leaves repel water, which woods burn well, which fibers hold together, which surfaces stay dry, which stay damp, which soften under pressure, which smell clean after rain. Moss would almost certainly have entered human awareness in that same sensory way. It is soft. It is absorbent. It appears in calm, damp places. It gathers in abundance in some regions. These are all qualities people would have observed long before anyone thought to describe moss in scientific language. In many environments, moss would not have been seen as scenery alone. It would have been part of the physical world people handled, stepped on, cleared away, gathered, or perhaps deliberately used. A person bedding down near a forest edge might notice how different moss feels from bare soil or rough leaf litter. Someone traveling through wet ground might notice where moss cushions a surface and where it suggests that moisture lingers. A family living in a cold or wooded region might come to know moss simply because it was there to be touched, seen, and worked with as part of everyday life. That is often how relationships between people and the natural world begin. Not with theory, but with repetition. A material is encountered again and again until its qualities become part of local knowledge. Moss, in this way, may have belonged to that broad category of quiet natural materials that people understood through use and experience. One generation notices it, another grows up with it. Over time, its properties become ordinary knowledge within a place, even if that knowledge is never written down. Its softness would have made it especially memorable. In a world where many natural surfaces were rough, cold, splintered, stony, or damp in less forgiving ways, moss offered a different kind of contact. It could cushion, it could line, it could soften. Even if a person never gathered it for practical use, simply seeing and feeling moss would have left an impression. Few things in the wild look as though they were designed to pad the earth itself. Moss often does. Its absorbency would have mattered too. A material that can hold moisture, respond to wet conditions, and remain soft in certain environments naturally, invites practical attention. People living closely with land tend to notice which materials hold water, which dry quickly, and which can be relied upon under changing weather. Moss's relationship with moisture would have made it more than a visual detail. It would have been a material with behavior, a substance that changed and responded in ways people could observe. There is also the simple fact of abundance. In some landscapes, moss can be found everywhere once the eye begins to notice it. That abundance makes use more likely, or at least makes experimentation more possible. A rare plant may be admired. A common one may become part of life. Moss, in many cool and wet regions, would have been common enough to become woven into daily familiarity. It would have belonged to the background of walking, resting, gathering, and sheltering. This likely means that human encounters with moss go much deeper in time than written records alone can show. People may have used moss, thought about moss, compared different kinds of moss, and passed along preferences or cautions about it across many generations without leaving behind detailed formal descriptions. The relationship may have been intimate without being loudly documented. Moss lends itself to that kind of history. It is quiet, useful, and easy to overlook from the outside, even when it is deeply familiar to the people living among it. And that is part of what makes the human story of moss so interesting. It probably did not begin as a curiosity. It began as presence. Moss was there, soft under the hand, damp in the right weather, abundant in certain places. Part of the forest, part of the wet ground, part of the lived surface of the world. Only later would people begin separating it into categories, naming types, and studying it in a formal way. Before all of that, moss was simply one of the materials the land offered. And because it was so soft, so absorbent, and so available in some environments, it was ready to become something more than familiar. It was ready to be used. Once moss moved from being a familiar part of the landscape into something people handled more intentionally, its practical uses begin to make a great deal of sense. Moss is soft in a way that many natural materials are not. It can be springy, pliable, and compressible. In the right conditions, it can also be gathered in quantity. That combination of softness and availability helps explain why moss found a place in human life not just as scenery, but as material. One of the most natural uses for moss would have been as bedding or padding. Anyone who has ever touched a thick patch of moss can understand why. Compared with bare ground, exposed roots, rough bark, or packed soil, moss offers a gentler layer between the body and the earth. It does not turn the ground into a mattress, of course, and it is not equally suitable in all conditions, but it does soften. In wooded or wet regions where moss was plentiful, it would have been easy to recognize that certain kinds could provide a more forgiving surface for resting, kneeling, or lining a space. This softness would have mattered in many ordinary situations. Moss could be gathered and placed beneath other materials to create cushioning. It could line a sleeping area, add comfort to a temporary resting place, or soften the inside of a shelter where the ground felt cold or uneven. It may also have been useful in situations where people wanted a natural material that compressed easily while still keeping some spring. Even a thin padded layer can make a hard surface feel far more livable. Its value as padding likely extended beyond sleep. Moss could be used wherever a soft barrier was helpful. Inside footwear, for example, it may have served in some traditions as a cushioning or insulating layer. Wrapped around fragile objects, it could protect them during carrying. Tucked into containers, it could help soften movement and prevent breakage. Lining and padding are humble uses, but humble uses often tell the most about how people lived closely with the materials around them. Moss did not need to be dramatic to be important. It only needed to work. Its absorbency added another practical advantage. A material that is both soft and able to hold moisture or buffer damp conditions has many possible uses, depending on place and tradition. Moss could help manage wetness in a space, especially when used in layers or combined with other natural materials. In some contexts, that may have made it useful in lining, wrappings, or as part of a barrier between body and ground. In other situations, the same absorbent quality would have made it less suitable if the moss itself was too wet. This is part of what makes historical natural material use so interesting. People were not just using one thing one way. They were learning which conditions made a material helpful and which conditions did not. Moss also offered a kind of flexible abundance. In places where it grew thickly, it could be collected without the difficulty of processing wood, weaving fibers, or shaping harder materials. That would have made it especially appealing for temporary or supportive uses. A material does not always need to last forever to matter. Sometimes it is enough that it is close by, easy to gather, and well suited to a specific purpose in the moment. Moss likely fit that role in many lives. It was the kind of material a person could know, trust, and turn to when softness was needed. There is also something revealing in the fact that moss was not only looked at, but touched and lived with. Modern people often experience moss mostly as a visual pleasure, noticing how it makes a garden feel ancient or a forest seem softer. But in older ways of living, especially those closer to seasonal weather and direct material use, moss may have been something felt far more often by hand, foot, and body. That physical relationship changes the meaning of the plant. It becomes less decorative and more intimate, less a symbol of softness and more an actual source of it. In that sense, moss belongs to a long category of natural materials that offered comfort in small but meaningful ways. It did not replace wood, fabric, or fur, but it could support them. It could line, cushion, insulate, and soften. It could make a hard world slightly gentler. And once a material becomes known for softness, absorbency, and contact with the body, another kind of use naturally begins to appear as well. Beyond comfort and padding, moss also entered traditions of care, especially where people valued its ability to absorb, cushion, and serve practical needs in healing contexts. Once a material becomes known for being soft, absorbent, and readily available, it is not surprising that people begin finding uses for it in contexts of care as well. Moss belongs to that category of natural material that sits close to the body and close to the practical realities of everyday life. It cushions, it holds moisture, or in some cases absorbs it. It can be gathered in quantity in the right environments. All of that helps explain why moss, and in some places peat-related materials, entered traditional practices of care long before modern medicine framed those uses in formal scientific terms. The important thing here is to think historically and locally. People in earlier times often worked with what the landscape offered. Knowledge developed through observation, repetition, and necessity. If a material seemed clean, soft, protective, or useful in managing dampness or fluids, it may have found a place in daily care. Moss would have been especially noticeable in this regard, because it did not need to be transformed much to show its practical qualities. A person could feel its softness immediately. They could see how it interacted with moisture. They could test it against skin, cloth, wood, or other natural materials and quickly understand that it behaved differently from dry leaves, bark, or packed grass. Some mosses and peat-related materials were used in historical settings for absorbent purposes, including in wound care and protective dressings. This was not because moss was some magical substance, but because its structure and moisture handling qualities made it practically valuable. In times and places where manufactured absorbent materials did not exist or were difficult to obtain, people naturally relied on what they had. Moss could become part of that quiet toolkit of survival and care. Its softness mattered here just as much as its absorbency. When the body is injured, irritated, or in need of support, roughness becomes a problem. A material that can rest gently against skin has immediate value. Moss could provide a softer contact layer than many other substances gathered directly from the wild. That alone would have made it worth noticing. In some traditions, what mattered may not have been that moss was ideal in every circumstance, but that it was available, gentle enough to handle, and useful when other options were limited. There is also something broader to say about how people understood healing landscapes in the past. Many communities did not divide the natural world into rigid categories of medicine, material, and environment the way modern people sometimes do. A forest, wetland, or river edge was not just scenery surrounding life. It was part of life's support system. Plants, soils, waters, fibers, bark, resins, and mosses all belong to a wider field of practical knowledge. In that kind of worldview, moss would not necessarily have been seen only as a plant. It may also have been understood as part of a caring landscape, one of the soft materials nature placed within reach. That does not mean every culture used moss in the same ways, or that every kind of moss was treated alike. Local conditions would have mattered greatly. So would tradition, climate, and experience. Some people may have valued moss primarily for bedding or padding, while others may have learned more specific uses tied to absorbency and protection. The same material can occupy different roles depending on what a community needs and what other resources are available. Moss is especially suited to this kind of flexible human relationship because it is both humble and useful. Peat-related materials also enter this story in interesting ways. In wetland regions, the slow buildup of plant matter created substances that could become associated with warmth, preservation, and sometimes therapeutic use in local traditions. These uses belong to a broader human pattern of working with soft, moisture-rich landscapes for practical comfort and care. Once again, the landscape itself becomes part of the story of healing, not just a backdrop to it. What stands out most is how well moss fits the logic of traditional care. It does not need to be spectacular. It only needs to do a few things reliably. Be soft, be available, be absorbent, be useful when life is lived close to the land. Many traditional materials survived in memory, not because they were glamorous, but because they helped in small, repeatable ways. Moss seems to belong to that family of quiet helpers. And that quiet helpfulness did not stop at healing contexts. Once people knew moss as something soft, absorbent, and easy to work with, it would naturally continue showing up in more ordinary parts of domestic life as well. It could line, fill, wrap, insulate, and support all kinds of everyday needs, becoming part of homes, containers, and practical routines in ways that were probably so familiar they were not always considered remarkable. For most of human history, daily life depended on quiet materials, not grand materials, not rare materials, but the humble ones that were close at hand and useful in small, dependable ways. Moss fits beautifully into that category. It is easy to imagine people noticing its softness, its absorbency, and the fact that in some regions it could be gathered in abundance, then slowly finding more and more places for it in ordinary life, not as a celebrated invention, but as a helper. One of the simplest uses moss may have had was in filling and lining spaces. A material that is soft, flexible, and able to compress easily can be useful wherever small gaps need to be softened or partly sealed. Moss could be tucked into cracks, packed into openings, or used as part of simple insulation in places where people needed to keep out drafts or make a structure feel a little less exposed. In that kind of use, moss would not have stood out dramatically. It would have done its work quietly, hidden in the edges of walls, roofs, containers, or joined materials. That hidden quality is part of what makes it interesting. Many of the most useful natural materials in older ways of living were not always visible once they were in place. They lined things, they filled spaces, they cushioned movement. Moss seems especially suited to that kind of role. It could soften the inside of a container, protect fragile contents, or sit between harder surfaces in a way that reduced friction and gave a bit of spring. A basket, a box, a wrap tool, a carried object, or a packed storage space could all potentially benefit from a soft natural lining. Its softness would also have made it useful for wrapping. A material does not need to be strong like rope or cloth to be valuable in packing. Sometimes its purpose is simply to cradle. Moss can do that. Around delicate objects, gathered plants, food, or tools, it could provide padding and reduce direct contact with harder surfaces. In a world without endless manufactured fillers, a material that could be gathered from the land and used to cushion or separate items would have had practical value. Its relationship with moisture also likely made it useful in certain kinds of storage and handling, though always depending on the conditions. Some materials are helpful because they breathe, soften, or buffer. Moss belongs to that family of useful intermediates. It is not always the star of a task, but it can make a task work better. That is often how natural materials become deeply woven into daily life. They solve little problems. They make things gentler. They make rougher systems more manageable. In some places, moss may have become so familiar in these roles that people hardly thought about it. That is often what happens with abundant, reliable materials. At first, they are noticed. Later, they are simply used. A child grows up seeing moss tucked into a wall seam, lining a basket, cushioning something fragile, or softening a corner of a sleeping space. And by adulthood, that use no longer feels remarkable. It just feels normal. Natural materials often become part of daily life in exactly that uncelebrated way. Their usefulness is so ordinary that it leaves few dramatic stories behind. That ordinary quality is important. Moss does not need to have been used everywhere, or by everyone, in the same form to matter historically. What matters is that it had the kind of qualities people repeatedly look for in a helper material. It was soft. It was often available. It could compress, cushion, line, and fill. It could assist rather than dominate. That may be why moss feels so believable in domestic history. It belongs naturally to the edge spaces of human life, the quiet places where practical comfort is made. And there is something fitting about that. Moss itself is an edge-dwelling plant. It gathers in cracks, on bark, over stones, across logs, and in the soft, damp places of the land. It seems almost destined to become a material of lining, filling, wrapping, and cushioning. Its nature in the wild mirrors its likely usefulness in human hands. Over time, materials like this often gather meanings beyond their practical role. Once something is known, not only for what it does, but for how it feels and where it is found, it begins to carry atmosphere with it. Moss is a perfect example. Even when it is no longer being used directly in homes or containers, it still carries associations that are emotional as much as practical. It brings thoughts of age, quiet, softness, and time. And from there, moss begins to move out of simple use and into story, memory, and symbol. Once a material has lived beside people for a long time, it rarely remains only practical. It begins to gather feeling around itself. Moss seems to do this especially easily. Even people who know very little about its biology often respond to it as though it means something. A moss-covered stone does not feel the same as bare stone. A fallen log wrapped in moss does not feel like ordinary wood anymore. Moss changes the emotional temperature of a place. It adds softness, but also something harder to name. Age, perhaps. Stillness, memory. The sense that time has been passing quietly here for longer than anyone has been watching. Part of this comes from what moss does visually. It settles onto surfaces that already suggest endurance, then deepens that impression. Stone walls, old trees, roots, roof tiles, ruins, and fallen trunks all seem older once moss appears on them. Moss softens edges, fills creases, and covers roughness in a way that makes a place feel less immediate and more layered. It suggests that enough time has passed for the world to become gentler around the object. Not newer, not fresher, but more absorbed into its surroundings. That is why moss so often appears in imagery connected to quiet old places. A ruin without moss can look abandoned. A ruin with moss often looks remembered. The difference is subtle but powerful. Moss does not erase age. It makes age feel softer. It turns damage into stillness. It turns exposure into atmosphere. A stone staircase touched by moss can feel like part of a story. A wall streaked with green can seem as though it belongs to rain, years, and silence all at once. Moss can also suggest forgottenness, though not always in a sad way. It appears where places are left undisturbed long enough for softness to gather. That can create the feeling that human urgency has faded there. The place is no longer being polished, cleared, or constantly handled. It has been allowed to rest. Moss often becomes the sign of that rest. It marks where time has resumed its slower pace. In this way, moss can feel connected not only to memory, but to release. It suggests that a surface has stopped being forced to stay new, and yet moss does not feel empty or dead. That is part of its symbolic richness. It is connected to age, but it is fully alive. It suggests quiet, but not absence. It covers old wood and ancient stone, but it does so with living green. Because of that, moss can symbolize endurance just as easily as fading. It shows that life continues in the still places. It shows that softness can outlast hardness. It shows that the world does not only move forward through growth that is fast and obvious. Sometimes it continues through low, patient greenness. In stories, artwork, and visual imagination, moss often appears where time seems to have slowed down. It belongs naturally to temple stones, woodland ruins, hidden paths, forgotten gardens, and ancient trees. Even when no one says anything about moss directly, its presence changes the mood. It tells the eye that this place is not rushed. It has weathered seasons. It has known rain. It has held still long enough for delicate life to claim it. That is why moss can make even a simple corner of a garden feel deeper than it is. It adds the suggestion of duration. Its symbolic power likely comes from the very same qualities that define its real life. Moss is low, patient, moisture-loving, and close to the surfaces of things. It does not arrive with force. It settles. It does not erase the object beneath it. It softens it. It does not rush. It remains. Those are not just biological facts. They are emotional impressions too. They are the reason moss lends itself so easily to themes of memory, stillness, gentleness, and time. There is something comforting in that. Many symbols of time focus on loss, decay, or disappearance. moss offers a quieter alternative. It suggests that age can also bring softness, that old things can become more beautiful by being gently overtaken by life rather than stripped by it. That memory can live not only in monuments and records, but in the silent greening of wood and stone. And perhaps that is one reason people still seek moss out so deliberately today. Even in carefully designed spaces where nothing is truly forgotten and very little is left to chance, moss continues to be valued for the atmosphere it creates. It carries that same old emotional language into the present, turning gardens, bonsai displays, and small design spaces into places that feel calmer, older, and more quietly alive. Even in the modern world, where so much of daily life happens indoors and many materials are chosen for convenience rather than feeling, moss has kept its appeal. People still bring it into design spaces on purpose. They place it in gardens, around stepping stones, beneath bonsai trees, inside terrariums, and across quiet decorative landscapes that are meant to feel calm rather than busy. This continued fascination says a great deal. Moss is not only admired because it is a plant, it is admired because of the atmosphere it creates. In gardens, moss often does something that flowers and shrubs do not. It softens without becoming loud. It can make a path seem older, a stone seem more settled, and the ground itself feel more complete. Moss fills visual gaps in a gentle way. Where another plant might call attention to itself through height, color, or bloom, moss stays low and quiet. It creates continuity. It helps separate objects feel joined into one scene. A few stones placed in earth can look arranged. Those same stones, touched by moss, can begin to look as though they belong there. This is one reason moss has become so closely associated with gardens designed for stillness and reflection. It supports a mood of patience. It makes a space feel less recently built and more gently inhabited by time. Even when planted or preserved deliberately, moss carries the impression that nature has been allowed to settle in. It gives design spaces a softer rhythm. The garden becomes not just something arranged, but something aged into beauty. Bonsai offers a particularly clear example of this. Around the base of a bonsai tree, moss can create the feeling of a miniature landscape rather than a plant in a container. It suggests ground, scale, and age. The tree no longer appears simply potted. It appears rooted in a tiny world. Moss helps create that illusion because it has such a strong relationship with old forests, quiet ground, and small hidden landscapes. Its presence can make the whole composition feel more believable, more peaceful, and more complete. Terrariums use moss in another but related way. Inside glass, moss often becomes a symbol of contained calm. It suits the enclosed, humid, miniature world of a terrarium almost perfectly. Because moss thrives close to moisture and does not need dramatic space, it can make even a very small container feel rich with life. It gives the impression of coolness, freshness, and quiet continuity. A terrarium with moss often feels less like decoration and more like a captured piece of a shaded forest floor. Modern design has also found ways to use moss more symbolically. It may appear in naturalistic interiors, preserved wall pieces, or spaces meant to feel grounded, organic, or restorative. Part of this is surely aesthetic. Moss is beautiful in a restrained way, But another part is emotional. Moss suggests a slower pace. It softens hard materials like stone, wood, glass, and metal simply by association. Even when it is used in a carefully controlled design context, it carries with it the memory of damp forests, old bark, quiet paths, and shaded places where time seems gentler. That is part of what makes moss so unusual among plants used in design. Its value is not only botanical. People are not usually drawn to moss because it grows tall, flowers brightly, or changes dramatically with the seasons. They are drawn to it because it changes the feeling of a space. It adds softness, age, calm, and a certain kind of visual humility. It can make a place feel alive without making it feel crowded. It can make a place feel old without making it feel neglected. In that sense, modern love for moss is not really new at all. It echoes much older human responses to the plant. People have long noticed its softness, its absorbency, its quiet usefulness, and its power to make a place feel gentler. What has changed is the setting. Moss may now appear in curated gardens or designed objects, rather than only in wild ground and practical daily use. But the attraction is still deeply familiar. People are responding to the same qualities they have likely responded to for generations. And behind all of that beauty and atmosphere is something even more impressive. Moss can create this feeling because it has endured for so long and so quietly. It remains soft, low, and visually gentle. Yet beneath that gentleness is a remarkable toughness. Its calm presence is supported by a patient kind of resilience, one that allows it to survive where many other plants would struggle. For something so soft, moss is remarkably hard to dismiss. It does not look tough in the way people usually imagine toughness. It has no bark, no trunk, no thorns, no thick protective shell. It stays low to the ground or close to the surface where it grows. And much of the time, it seems almost delicate, as though a dry day or a rough hand could erase it entirely. But moss has endured across immense stretches of time, and it continues to live in places where many other plants would struggle to begin. Its resilience is real. It is simply a quiet kind of resilience. One of the most fascinating examples of this is the way some mosses can survive drying out and then revive again when moisture returns. To a human eye, a dried patch of moss may appear lifeless, faded, and brittle. It can seem as though the green softness has been lost completely. And yet in some cases, once water returns, the moss can awaken again, regaining softness and color. That ability changes the emotional feel of moss quite a lot. It is not merely a plant that survives when conditions are easy. It is a plant that knows how to wait. That waiting is important. Many forms of life cope with stress by moving, storing, or defending. Moss often copes by enduring stillness. It remains in place. It lowers its visible activity. It lets the harsh period pass as best it can, staying close to the surface of the world until water comes back. This is not a dramatic strategy, but it is a deeply effective one. Moss does not need to outrun change. It needs to outlast it. Its small size helps here rather than hurting it. Because moss lives in intimate contact with surfaces, it can take advantage of tiny pockets of favorable conditions that larger plants may not be able to use as easily. A cool crack in stone, the shaded side of bark, a damp hollow in wood, a strip of moisture along the base of a wall. These places may be too small or too unstable for bigger plants, but they can be enough for moss. Moss survives not by conquering vast space, but by finding the overlooked places where survival remains possible. This is one reason moss appears so often on difficult surfaces. It can settle on wood that is decaying, bark that is rough, rocks that are cool and damp, and patches of soil where conditions fluctuate. It does not need much depth. It does not need dramatic fertility. It needs a foothold, some moisture, and the patience to expand slowly. Over time, that patience becomes a form of strength. And moss truly does spread with patience. It is rarely a plant of sudden spectacle. It does not burst upward overnight into towering visibility. It gathers, thickens, extends, and settles gradually. Because of that, people may overlook its success. Fast growth tends to impress us more than slow persistence. But moss shows another model of endurance. It survives by being modest in its demands and steady in its presence. Its progress is easy to miss until one day a stone, log, or trunk seems to have turned green almost without anyone noticing. There is something deeply fitting in that. Moss belongs to edges, undersides, shaded trunks, and cool ground. Its resilience matches those places. It is not the resilience of force or height. It is the resilience of contact. Contact with bark, contact with stone, contact with moisture when moisture is available, and with time when time is all there is. Moss survives by staying close to the surface of things and close to the slow rhythms of its environment. Perhaps that is why moss feels so ancient, even when it is fresh and green. Its resilience is not loud enough to feel modern. It feels old in the best sense, like a way of living that has worked for so long it no longer needs to prove itself. Moss has been soft for ages. It has also been patient for ages. And patience, in the natural world, can become a kind of invisible power. By the time a person notices this, moss no longer seems like just a decorative layer on bark or stone. It begins to feel like a lesson in another style of endurance. Not the endurance of rising higher, hardening more, or taking over quickly, but the endurance of returning, holding on, and continuing quietly in places where life is easy to miss. And that may be the most remarkable thing about moss of all. It lives so humbly that people often walk past it without thought, even though it is carrying age, resilience, softness, and persistence in every little patch. The next time someone passes a mossy root, a shaded stone, or a green strip along a wall, they may still see only a blur of color. But if they pause a little longer, they may begin to see a whole hidden world. By the end of a long look at moss, what feels most striking is not that it is rare, but that it is so easy to ignore. Moss is one of the most familiar forms of life in many landscapes, and also one of the most overlooked. People pass it on tree roots, stones, logs, roofs, old walls, shaded soil, and garden edges without giving it much thought. It is often seen only as a soft green blur, part of the background, rather than a subject in its own right. And yet that small blur contains far more than it first appears to. Moss softens the world in quiet ways. It gathers along bark and makes a trunk look older and calmer. It spreads over stone and turns hardness into something gentler. It settles across roots, roofs, and fallen wood, and gives those surfaces the feeling of having been lived with by rain, shade, and time. Moss rarely announces itself through height or color. It does not compete with flowers or tree canopies for attention. Instead, it works at the level of closeness. It changes the surfaces people touch, step over, and glance past. It makes the ordinary world feel less bare. There is something beautiful in how much it holds together. Moss carries the memory of very early plant life on land. It belongs to one of the older lineages in the living green world, linking a damp forest floor today with the far older story of life learning to live on land at all. It also belongs to the present, shaping moisture, softening forest surfaces, and creating shelter for tiny lives that depend on the cool, damp spaces it helps maintain. Moss connects ancient earth to everyday ground. It also connects people to place in a way that can feel deeply human. Long before modern science named and classified moss, people would have known it by touch, by sight, and by use. It could soften bedding, line containers, fill gaps, cushion objects, and become part of practical daily life. Later, it would gather emotional meaning too, becoming associated with old stones, quiet ruins, memory, gentleness, and the slow, visible passage of time. Even now, people still bring moss into gardens, bonsai displays, terrariums, and design spaces, because it creates an atmosphere that few other plants can create so gently. What makes all of this even more remarkable is how little moss seems to ask for. It does not need deep soil, towering space, or loud conditions. It asks for moisture, shade, a surface to settle on, and enough time to remain. With that, it can do an extraordinary amount. It can hold water close to the ground. It can soften the forest floor. It can help shape tiny living worlds. In some places, mosses can even contribute to the formation of bogs and peatlands, helping create whole wet landscapes over time. Such a small plant can have a surprisingly large reach. And yet moss never loses its feeling of intimacy. No matter how old its lineage is, how ecologically important it may be, or how much history it has shared with people, it still feels close. It belongs to the level of hands, footsteps, damp bark, shaded stones, and low, quiet corners. It reminds people that not all important life is large or dramatic. Some of it is soft, patient, and easy to miss. Perhaps that is why moss feels so peaceful to look at. It offers a different vision of success in the living world. Moss does not rush. It does not tower. It does not force its way into view. It stays low, stays close, and changes its surroundings gently. It survives through patience. It creates beauty through softness. It leaves its mark by making places feel more settled, more connected, and more alive. So the next time a patch of moss appears at the edge of a path, across the base of a tree, or over the face of an old stone, it may no longer seem like a simple coating of green. It may feel more like a small living world that has been there all along. Ancient, useful, resilient, calming, and quietly full of life, waiting for someone to notice that the softest things in a landscape can also be the deepest.